Welcome back to the Pastor's Podcast. Pastor Scott here with Pastor Jim.
Hello.
Hey, Jim. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
And joining us via satellite phone from Guam is Pastor Kevin Elwell.
Well, hello. Half a day. That's what we say here.
Wait, you don't. Do you actually say top of the day?
No, half a day. Half a day. That's the local greeting. It's H-A-F-A, hafa, and then a day,
okay,
A-D-A-I, half a day.
All right. That I feel like that makes more sense than top of the day.
No, not top of the day.
So you leave good out. It's like half a day, just like have a day. Don't have a good day or a bad day. Just have a day. Is that what that means?
It's not. It's not half. It's hafa. It's like it's our version of aloha. You know, Hawaii has aloha. We have half a day. But it does,
kind of downgraded from aloha. Yes, I want to say.
I don't know. I kind of like half a day.
Oh, it's not like Jimmy Hoffa. I don't know. It's the wrong.
Things are very, slow paced here, and I think the etymology of that would be that was the desired amount of time that you wanted to work in a day. So I don't know. But,
sounds good to me.
Good. So we are, we're going to consider this essentially a bonus episode in our Cornerstone History podcast series. We've done 8 episodes. We've done 8 episodes.
Have we really?
We've done 8.
It seemed like 20.
8 volumes of the Cornerstone History podcast. And we've got one more to go. We're going to be recording in the next couple of weeks as we recount kind of the first 10 years of Cornerstone. But we thought we'd stop and check in with Kevin Elwell after he got thrown under the bus multiple times on our last podcast. No, so Kevin and I were talking. Actually, maybe a week after we'd recorded that, Kevin and I were chatting. I'm like, oh man, you got to listen to this, and the idea of having Kevin come on to correct all of our mistakes.
Yeah, right.
I didn't hear a bunch of mistakes. The one thing you guys kept talking about Jim's coffee comment at the coffee shop where he said, I'm cautiously pessimistic. But I remember going back to my office or home and telling my wife, well, Jim said he was cautiously optimistic. That's the way I heard it. So that's the only thing I remember a little differently was one word.
You misquoted me? Golly.
So Kevin, we've been having these conversations about like the history of First Baptist, the history of Cornerstone. Maybe even for those that don't know you, what was, I think we introduced it a little bit during our episode, but what is it that brought you to First Baptist, and when did you come here? Do you even remember?
Oh yeah, of course. Well, there's so many. You'd have to go back to a guy named John Spiegel, and John Spiegel was a member of First Baptist, and he was working for Google down the street there from the church, and but he was a kid in my youth group when I was a youth pastor here in Guam. So he used to come over to my house, and we would do these Bible studies, and my wife would fix awesome food. It was a bunch of guys, and then we would play this N64 game, James Bond, and we called the evening bonding time. It was the guys' bonding time. That's what we called it.
Clever.
So, but he ends up he goes to school. I also taught him because I was a teacher here at a Christian school in Guam, and John was in my class. I coached him. So I had a really deep relationship with him. He went to First Baptist. He lands there. I am, at the time he lands at First Baptist, going to church there. Jerry Wilkie's the pastor. I'm in San Diego finishing my Master's of Divinity, but I'm a college coach. And I finish up my Master of Divinity, and I remember talking to my wife saying, I really like coaching, and there's a lot about college coaching that is very pastoral, because I was doing men's and women's, about 20 to 25 kids per team. And there was a lot of pastoral nature to that. I liked it a lot. The teams were getting a little bit better than when I first started. And I was like, maybe the Lord just wants to stay here. And then John calls out of the blue, and we're talking, catching up, and he says, hey, would you ever consider being a youth pastor again? And the first thing that went through my head was, no way. After talking with him, I was like, he really wanted me to come up and just meet with the pastor, Jerry Wilkie. And I remember agreeing to it. I said, okay. And so the day came. So John set up this meeting, and I was going to drive, and Jerry was north, and he was going to drive south. We're going to meet halfway. And I just remember going out the door, turning to my wife, saying, this is going to be a royal waste of time. And I drove all the way up there, and I met with Jerry, and we're just talking. And if you hear Jerry tell his side of the story, he says, I'm sitting there talking to you, and about 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour in, I start realizing this guy's not trying to sell me. Like, I don't know if he wants the job. And I'm just talking to him, and I really like Jerry. And when we left, I remember leaving, we were like, well, let's pray about it, And so that was kind of what opened the door. I prayed about it. We came up and visited. I brought Missy. And really what that was about was, would I make the transition into full-time ministry? Because I had never really been in full-time ministry at a church. I had always been a part-time youth guy and lots of different hats in ministry, but never full-time. And I was always teaching or doing other things. So I came to First Baptist. The first year was an awesome year, and got to know people in the church really well. But I think I became known as the crazy youth guy because of all the zany things I did. The first year I was there, we did the Oktoberfest. We turned it into this like gigantic thing. I was renting bouncers, and we had the lamplighter class, which was the oldest people. They were like baking pies and doing cakewalks and stuff. And it was just a herd of people came out of the neighborhoods into this thing. And it was, and then I met you, Scott. That was when I met you because they had me be a chaplain.
The Harvest Festival we know today is thanks to Kevin Elwell. I mean, they were doing it before, but the next level Harvest Festival is thanks to Kevin Elwell.
Yeah, I remember I went around and collected these refrigerator boxes and connected them and made this giant maze where you would crawl through it. And Jim kept coming in and looking in and what is going on in this room, And finally he says, can I help you do anything? And I gave him some duct tape. Tape these boxes together. That was one of the things I loved about Jim is he would always come and see what I was doing and just say, how can I help you? So I think he felt sorry for me, but...
I thought you were going to burn down the church. That's my...
Yeah. Okay, so this is one of my questions, because Jerry inherited you, Jim.
Yeah, yes.
And then you guys met.
Jim inherited me?
And then you hired Kevin, and Jim kind of inherited you. What was your first impression of Jim Leonard, Kevin? That's one of the things I want to know.
Careful now.
Guam
isn't that far away.
Okay, his office was right next to mine. And I remember, you had that little first entrance where there's like 1,000 books in the room.
Yeah, he had a vestibule into his private office.
It was if I was, and he had these wicker chairs, and we used to sit in there and talk a lot. I always thought if there's an earthquake, we're going to be buried by books, but
it's true.
But I don't know. I just thought I always saw him as a godly man who was an ally in ministry, I guess, and I really enjoyed sitting and talking with him all the time. And but I remember the first year there was I was a little unaware as to all of the background that I think you've talked about. There was a power control struggle going on behind the scenes, which I knew nothing about when I came up to the church, And
they didn't include that in the interview, huh?
No.
Somehow I managed to forget that one.
No, but well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, everything was new to me in the sense of being in full-time ministry in a church, but also just living in the city. I had never lived in the city like that. Our first home was in Northridge, and it's like I'm doing these 45-minute to an hour and a half, sometimes drives, depending on the traffic, I had never done that in my life. So there was a lot of new stuff in the first year. The first 2 years were very different than the second 2 to 3. So,
yeah. So, I mean, as we recollect it, Kevin, I think we all pretty much blame you for the idea of the merge. Is that how you remember it, or how did that come about?
Well, okay, so this, I think, I listened to your podcast. I was thinking about it, and the way that I remember this is you and I developed a really good relationship. Scott was the athletic director, and I was, which I thought was funny because I had been an athletic director and you had done my job. Like we had done each other's jobs before. And so you and I were always talking about this, and I think that you and I developed a good relationship because of the school and the difficulty in ministering to those kids. The Christian school that was attached, to the church. I don't know if you've ever mentioned that, but I didn't realize like the vast majority of the kids in the school were not believers, and I came in like, I'm going to have all these Christian kids, I'm going to teach them the Bible. And it was like not like that at all. So, anyways, I mean, talk about bonding with Scott. We had this, basketball game where it was like all the high school basketball varsity boys against the teachers, and I got in on that team. And we wore like the old uniforms we found in some back closet from like 1970s, and they had shrunk down. And we come running out, and it's almost like my shorts were like inching towards Speedo-ishness, and it was like the kids were just dying laughing, And imagine Scott Mell in a tiny shrunken basketball uniform.
I don't want to hear this part.
Yeah, and so we bonded a lot through the school. And I think that was the first thing I would say is because the idea about merging was really about joining a relationship with Scott, because and Brian had come in and taught in the chapel once, so I knew Brian a little bit, but not at all like Scott, and I think that was the thing. And then I would say, the time came with Jerry. I remember coming in, Jerry saying, that he was going to be resigning, and I was like really surprised by that. He had just hired me, and I'd been there.
You just hired me.
I know. I don't. I had this vision of 10 years in ministry, and then as I began to learn about, and I'll tell you this, that there was a trustee who had come to me and said, as I think they were checking on me, because of the surprise of Jerry resigning, and I remember a line they said to me was, because they were like, they said, when you came in the first year and you did your VBSs and the Harvest Festival and all this, he says, we had hoped that we could turn things around, but not. And I was like, what does that mean? So like,
but not.
Yeah, I was like, no, we need to make changes. Basically, was the sentiment I was hearing, and so. I remember, I sat with Jim a lot, but then just kind of around the corner with Steve's office, and I would sit with Steve a lot too. And I remember Steve making this comment that his desire was to pass a baton on to a younger generation of men and leaders who could protect good doctrine. That was one of his main desires, and that made me think about your church, because your church was doing really well, Shoreline, and you guys had like several hundred attendees, members who were in the 20-year-old age range. So the next piece that I would give you is I started working on a doctorate during this time, and that was actually initiated partly by John Spiegel, so his name kind of comes back into this. But we were studying churches and stuff in that, and the decline of churches, and that kind of fed into this sermon that I got up to preach one day at First Baptist, and it became known as the donut hole sermon. I don't know if you remember that, Jim.
I remember that.
And the analogy was like church is a donut, but there's a hole in the middle, and the hole that we're missing is the generation of 20-year-olds. We had like no 20-year-olds in the church, and so we had this vibrant kids and youth ministry, and then families with kids who were a little bit older, all the way up to the lamplighters, the oldest generation. but we just hardly had anyone in like a young professionals, like singles or dinks, double income, no kids type of people. And that was like all Shoreline was. And I had this thought like, man, they could be the donut hole to our donut, And so I got up and I remember speaking about that. And then one day, Scott, you were coming out the office, the glass door, and we were passing by. I was going in, and I said to you, "Hey, I want to get together and have coffee with you." And I had this thought, like, what would you think about if our churches ever merged? Something of that nature. That's not verbatim at all, but that was the first time I remember I broached the idea with you, Scott. I don't know. Do you recall that at all?
So my memory is so fuzzy because I feel like I do remember, and actually, okay, now that you're saying that, I'm wondering now if the next thing we did though, because I remember having a phone call, because I remember pacing in my backyard, like being like, what in the world is he talking about?
Well, that could have been.
And so I think it may have been right after that conversation.
After that, yeah. And
then we had a phone call, and then after that, you and Brian and I got together.
Now I want to weave something else in because when unless your podcast, you didn't mention this part, but there was a year where Matt came in and helped me with the youth group. He's not even part of our church. There's no merge yet. Do you remember this?
Oh.
And he got to know me. I
totally had forgotten.
I got to know Matt because he was a helper in the youth group. And there's all these funny moments where, if Matt is listening to this, he will recall some of these, but like we took, he came along as a helper, I can't remember. I think it was the high school. We did a retreat up to Big Bear, and we had a big football game. And Matt was Matt and I we're all playing with the high school boys, and Matt ended up on one side, and I'm on the other. We're playing against each other, and we had to guard each other. And we about 3/4 of the way through, we realized we were exerting all this energy on trying to defend each other. And we went up to the line, and we're like, we're just killing each other. The two old guys on the field, And in the end, at the end of that year, Matt went to Starbucks, he and I, and we were sitting down, and he was going to tell me that he wasn't going to continue to be a helper. I think he was busy with a lot of things, moving with Shoreline and stuff. But I remember him giving me some pointers on youth ministry, and I always remember that. And then as everything transpired, he ended up becoming the youth guy, and so I was like, careful what you ask for. Now that I look back on it, But I really loved Matt, him being a helper, but at one point I had this thought, like, did Scott send Matt, as kind of a spy to get to know me,
I wish I'd been that smart, man. We were just kind of like fumbling along while the Lord was just planting all of these different connections and seeds and
So the only other thing I would weave in was a conversation with Jim where when Jerry left and then he was asked to be the interim pastor, and we were sitting in those wicker chairs under the mountain of books, and he says to me, there was a decision made about we're not going to get a new pastor until we get this new constitution, and I become more and more aware of the history of, Jerry was brought in to make a new constitution. That was one of the main things, and I believe the pastor before him, Jim, knows the history better than I do, but there had been this pattern, right? And Jim, I remember having this conversation with Jim, and maybe Steve was in some of that, and it was like, we need to focus on changing the Constitution before we bring in another pastor, because it's like you're asking a pastor to come in and deal with a problem that's, going on for decades, I guess. So, So there was that. I think those things came together to lead into the merge, because we started to talk with you guys about the merge, which you kind of laid out in the other podcasts, is the coffee meetings. It went from the coffee meetings to Steve's house, and what I remember is being more of a middle guy, because you guys were younger than me, but Steve and Jim were older. So it's really interesting to go between you guys and hear you guys talk about your perception. Because we could have a meeting at Steve's house, but then I could talk with Scott and say, well, what'd you think of that? And you guys would tell me from your perspective as younger guys, younger pastors. And I would talk to Steve and Jim, and and they would have their perspective, on it. And I remember, Scott, you did a masterful job of kind of putting together like a timeline of how Emerge might work. And I remember in some of those conversations seeing I wrote down one example. It was, we had this meeting, and we were trying to deal with replacing a roof on the church. And I remember you and Brian were like sticker shock. He was like, I can't remember offhand, but I mean, it was like a big number, like $70,000, $80,000 to fix this roof. And your perspective of these young guys was like, that was wasteful to put money into like a building.
Well, that's more than half our budget.
I know. and I remember Brian like asking some question of, I can't remember verbatim. It was basically like how, like the integrity of spending so much money on a building, and rather spend it on supporting ministries in other ways. And it was, I think it was Steve. And Steve said, well, what are you going to do when families show up on Sunday morning and put their kids in the nursery and water's coming through the roof, dripping on their kids? Something like that. And Brian was just like, I never thought about it that way, because there was also I think the difference between the two groups was that you guys hadn't, owned a building and dealt with all the problems that come with that, right? So, which, I always wanted to ask you, like, how's that going, Scott and Brian, now that you have...
Those are questions we keep asking ourselves every year. Every year. Oh, man. Yeah, it's a whole new world, that's for sure. And a steep learning curve. I mean, it was a fascinating and steep learning curve. And actually, I mean, that... that reminds me, Kevin, like, I feel like, and I may have mentioned this in the previous podcast, but one of the things that stood out to me that I think actually made this possible was not just the humility, and particularly of you guys and your openness, but the grace and the kindness. I mean, looking back, I just feel like I experienced a lot of grace. And I remember, I remember getting like, I don't know, there was a meeting, we were discussing some topic or some controversial topic, and I got like more worked up than was like probably appropriate in a pastor's meeting. I don't know. I got loud, and and felt like I had, crossed a line. And it wasn't anything like bad, but it just felt like in my demeanor I had crossed a line. And so I, came back and I apologized. And I remember Steve just putting his hand on my shoulder and basically laughing it off, and just said, "Oh, don't worry, son. That's just a young man's mistake."
Well, I would say that I experienced that too, and I have some examples of that. But I was thinking chronologically through this. At this point, it's like, we're talking about the murders, but we had to stop. There was a point where we had a meeting, and you guys were like, "Well, all this depends on whether the vote of the Constitution." And I really remember there being this moment where it was like we'd done all this work and built these relationships, and it was like we had to hit a pause button. And then you guys were going to be like, "We're going to be praying for you, watching from the other side," and that was a fight that you guys couldn't help with, So, and that's where I would lean in on Jim a lot and his leadership through all of that, and. So we're going through that, and that was, to me, the equivalent of earning a degree at some university. That time period, the experience of that was so rich, and the faith building in it. But just the interactions, learning about what church, essentially politics are like. So, but I remember I wanted to tell a story to be an example of this, but it's like we were going through this. There was a moment where a letter, a packet went out to everyone in the church. You know, I don't know if you've talked about that at all. I can see Jim sighing as soon as I say that.
we haven't in too much detail. I tried to kind of just talk about it in broad swaths.
I see. So anyways, there was a moment where, you know, there was just a lot of pressure. And I remember there's a couple in the church, Zach and Ginger. And Zach had been helping me in the youth group. And we had developed a good relationship with him. And they had been away. They essentially had been on some trip. And they were gone for a while, and when a lot of things had transpired. And they had come back into town, and it's like they showed up at their house, and there was this packet, you know, and it had was questioning the leaders of the church, essentially. And he called me, you know. So what I remember is he's on the call, and I remember the Austins were a part of the call. I remember Nicole and Zach being the main people talking to me, and they were wanting to know about the information in this. And so I'm interacting with them on that. And, you know, the thing that I would say about it was I remember hanging up feeling like they were being influenced, you know. And it was a bit of a blow to me. Because particularly Zach was someone I was close to. And it upset my wife, and she said, "What are you going to do about it?" And I was like, "What can I do?" You know, and my wife kept kind of probing me on it. You know, we've got to do something. And what came out of that was like, maybe I should be preaching tomorrow, because we had some missionary scheduled to preach, and he was going to preach something totally unrelated to everything that was going on in our church, and I just kind of felt like.
Yeah, the week before, everybody, he's preaching, but everybody just got this manifesto
exactly,
in the mail.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And so I sat down and stayed up late putting together a sermon. And I had remembered I had been at a conference with Jerry Wilkie. You know, I mean, of all the names to drop here, it was Mark Driscoll. But he had preached this great sermon on pastors and standing up and preaching truth, you know, and I remembered that, and I had taken some of the points that he had made and built this sermon, and so I came in early in the morning on that Sunday, and there was Steve, and I think Jim was there, and the missionary was there, and I walk in, and they're talking to him, and I said, "I think the Lord wants me to preach today." They're like, "What?" You know, I think the Lord wants me to preach today, you know, and there was this conversation that happened. You know, I think the missionary, they said, "Could you leave the room?" And then me and Jim and Steve were talking. Jim, do you remember any of this? Or
yes, I had forgotten it, but I remember it now. Thanks for reminding me. It's a great moment.
And you guys were like, "Okay, if you really feel the Lord's leading you like this." And so I remember the missionary was like, they were giving him a stipend to preach, and then he just sat in the front row and listened to the sermon. But we still paid him, you know.
And cashed his check, yeah.
Yeah, but I still got up, and I preached this sermon, and it was really like an exhortation to the church, and it had a lot to do with that the church historically had been hard on its pastors. That was my sermon. And that God gives you pastors to lead you, and you had been very hard, and pastors had been leaving this church, and you know, and that, you know, I think it drew a bit of a line, because one of the trustees had come up and said to me something like, you know, that didn't go well, or something, you know, like for them. So that initiated a series of town halls, and I just felt like being this voice for like truth in all of it. And I remember a town hall I came to, and I waited. They made some rules, like you could only speak one time. So I waited till everybody talked. So I wanted to hear what all that was said, and then I stood up and corrected things that were said by people on the other side who were trying to lead the church to rebel against the leaders of the church. So I felt like that was a role that, you know, God, I think he paired Jim and I together really well through all of that. I couldn't have done what Jim did. It's the history that he had gave a lot of credibility. And then, but there was another guy, I didn't hear you mention his name. He was the professor from Masters. Do you remember his name, Jim?
Mackey. R.W.
Yes,
Mackey.
R.W. Mackey. Yeah. He really, I thought, helped validate a lot of the Jim and I and the leaders because he came in, he got an assessment, and I know that he was approached by leaders on the other side of that, and he basically rebuffed them and said, I remember he told me this, he said, if I ever teach in a class how to lead the church through a change, what you're doing will be my example of what not to do. Like he said that to them, you know, but there was a way of God putting Mackey there to affirm Jim and I and other leaders in a really hard time. You know, I don't know if these things have been said in all the podcasts, but
no, I really appreciate it, Kevin. I think it is a testament to what the Lord did and how He put, particularly you guys in these positions in ways that you didn't see coming, that you didn't could never have envisioned, but that He was orchestrating something bigger out of love for His church and care for the sheep. And we could talk more about that in all sorts of different ways. I want to fast forward a little bit.
Back to the merging.
Well, because we merged. Right. I want to fast forward. I mean, I actually want to fast forward away because we all went through all this. Mm-hmm. Then again, we kind of had the year of the merge, which we've talked about. And we merged.
Can I add one thing?
2 months later. Oh, okay. Go ahead. Yeah,
because you said you were experiencing grace, but I did too. Like I remember you put together those dinners, which I heard you talk about, and the guys that came were Carlos and Jackie came over to my house, and he's a soccer guy, and I'm a soccer guy, and I'm coaching kids, and then so he says I want to come watch you coach on Saturday, so he comes to watch. It's the one game he comes to, I get upset and yell at the ref, and they throw me out of the game. You know, it's like, and Carlos is like, this is the guy that we're going to merge with. You know, that's what I was thinking. Like, I just ruined something. And then he goes, he was so gracious to me, man, and I really felt ministered to him in that moment. And then there was another moment where you did the preaching swap. And I went over and preached at your church, and I felt like I just bombed, you know, really bad, you know. I don't know if you remember this.
I do remember that.
'Cause I remember, like, the first half of my sermon was okay, and then I kind of launched off on this demography statistics and all this, and then your church wasn't used to that. And I remember going home and telling my wife, I don't think I did that well, you know. And to be fair, the vast majority of my preaching experience was to high schoolers and kids, and you know, and preaching on Youth Pastor Sunday at First Baptist. But you came over to my office and you sat there, and I thought the way you talked to me was very gracious, and I have remembered that forever. You know, there were some things you said in that conversation that still affect my preaching, you know? And I like think about like when I'm writing a sermon, sometimes I think back to some of the things you said, you know? So there was grace going both ways, but I think that's partly God weaving it together, you know?
Yeah, I think that's an incredible testament to me to the fact that the ways these things works and the ways God builds the church isn't by everybody getting it right.
That's
right.
For sure.
I think that's the temptation, right? I think the temptation is that to think that the way that we build the church is by everybody getting it right. But that's not God. That's not the gospel. Mm-hmm. Right? The gospel is that He builds it through grace. He builds it through us walking with one another through our limitations and weaknesses and failures. In kindness,
yes,
as He builds to His glory, right? Not to ours. Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask, how then? I mean, you were such an instrumental part. You're such a huge part of this, Kevin. The Lord used you in so many different ways. We kind of set up and we were like off and running, and we take one step, and you exit stage right to Guam.
Yeah.
Well, can you explain that, please?
You did. There was a line you said in a podcast that was accurate, where I remember sitting in with Steve, Jim and I sitting with Steve, and we weren't sure how the vote would go. And I remember him saying, you need to fire up your resume. And I remember going, whoa, what?
Yep.
And that I did that, and I mean, I won't get into all the details, but that's how God led us back to Guam. Sure. We had always felt like we would come back to Guam, but honestly, there was a point in West LA where I told Missy, I could stay here for 10, 15 years. I really liked the ministry here, and I love the people. And so it took that experience, going through that, to nudge us out of that and look somewhere else. And that's what happened. My brother was the youth pastor here at the church I'm pastoring at now, and I began to dialogue with him. And the senior pastor here was looking for an associate to come along. He needed help, and that's kind of what opened that door. And so, then what happened was the vote favored us staying and moving to one board and all of this, right? And then we began to amp up the merger conversation. And that's where I began to struggle with guilt a little bit, because I could see God moving us in another direction. And so I was really careful with all of my conversation with Jim in particular, because Jim and I, we'd have these meetings with you guys, and Jim and I would get together and talk about it. And he would ask my opinions. And I remember I would give him my opinions, but then I would always come back to it. I actually wrote it down. I wrote down here in quotes, "It has to be you, Jim." It has to be you're the final decision. Because in my head I was like, you're the one. I didn't know yet for sure, but if I left, I knew that he would be the one that would have to live with it. Like. How is the Lord leading you? If you feel the Lord is leading you to say, yes, I'm going to support you in there. I'm a believer in it. But I didn't want to overplay my confidence in the merger, I guess, if that's a way to frame it, to influence Jim too much. And it was like I kept trying to take the answer back to, it's you and God. How's the Lord leading you? So I don't know if you recall those conversations, Jim, or...
Oh, yeah. I kept looking at my mail for a letter from a church in Guam who wanted me, I could leave. And it never came, and there I was,
Well, I felt like people would be mad at me, because there were some people in the church who, Jim and I led them through this hard battle. And a lot of them, I think, coming out on the other side felt like, well, it was hard fought, but we have Jim and Kevin who've led us through this. And then for me to then just leave, it was like, especially because there were a lot of people who walked with us because of the relationships I had through youth and kids ministry. I had a lot of really deep relationships there. I knew that would be difficult, and that I also felt like there might be a few families who maybe they wouldn't stay, but I felt it was right because, before, I don't know where in the timeline this happened, but I think it was around the donut hole sermon, but there was a study that you guys had some company do, and they were like, you guys have the highest density of essentially 20-year-olds of like most any church in America. And I was like, the people we need to reach are, the Shoreline's doing it. Like, they figured out how to reach this. And I felt like it was going to be a win-win in terms of the gospel, because it's like you got 200 missionaries in the age range that you're trying to reach, So I felt confident in it, but then, I knew that me leaving would be hard on Jim. And I felt like you would have to deal with people that were maybe angry, and coming to you. So I don't know. You've never told me any of that. How many people?
Well, here's the time, Jim. You can let it all out on Kevin.
Got a few things to say to you, Kevin. No, you know what? Thanks a lot. No, you know what? The timing was God's grace. It was perfect. It made an opening, I think, for innovating figuring out some new ways to do things, and I think it was very hard, but the whole thing was hard. It was great that you didn't leave sooner. You could have stayed longer, but it was great that you didn't leave sooner, because we got through that, and then we started basically what was a new church, and I think the downside of that was I really missed you terribly. We'd gone through this together. We were partners, and I think it was really difficult in that sense. But I was glad for you, and I was glad for the move. And I think even at the time I was saying, God's got this. God's got Kevin. He's got me. He's got Shoreline, the merge, two churches forming one church. It was all just, to me, an amazing piece of God putting the tiles on the roof to keep out the storm, make it perfect.
That's so true. Well, Kevin, the other thing, I mean, we could.
Can we talk about where we're at now?
Yeah, I do, but I was going to run there because that's kind of what, where I was headed. I'm moving along, but I do want to stop and just not rush past what you said, Jim, because I think that's such a beautiful reminder of how God did build His church and how He's continuing to build His church.
Yeah, amazing.
It's humbling, and it's an incredible privilege to get to be a part of. Both here, and it's a part of the story of how He was building His church in Guam, how He was building, and the plan He had for Bayview that again none of us could see, but that He was orchestrating. And so, I mean, Kevin, I would love for, especially for those that were here and do remember you so fondly, remember this time. I mean, we've stayed in touch over the years, and I've gotten to know about what's going on the island, how the Lord's been building the church there over the last decade. I mean, there's it's a big timeline, but I would love just for you to describe a little bit about what the Lord's doing there. Yeah,
I can shrink it down to a couple minutes. I've learned that one of the ways God's wired me is to come into environments that need help revitalizing. And that's what this church that I'm at now needed. It was in decline. It hadn't made its budget in like 7 years. They were running in a deficit. They were losing members. And so God brought me into this. In the first 2 years, I was just the associate, but it gave me time to really learn about the church and the culture. And I told my wife the other day, the first 10 years we were here, and I had told her if we go there, we got to stay at least 10 years. It's going to take 10 years to turn that around. And the Lord has been so gracious in teaching me a lot over, like He teaches me something in the moment that I'm going to need in the next moments. And that's been, even LA is an example of that, bringing me here. I felt like I was never going to face anything as scary as I had in LA. And so like that's the biggest giant ever. And so in some ways, like anything that rears its head here is like, this is like, a dwarf compared to the Goliath of LA. So that there's truth in that. And because you saw how God worked in that moment in LA, and it was phenomenal to see that. I mean, to literally feel like this is going to be lost, and then for God to like turn it around was just amazing. So, but 10 years on, we focused on helping the church grow, and it has. It's grown. It's we run 2 services now, and we have a church we're helping plant this summer. But one of the things that's come out of that, and I don't have time to go into how all of this unfolded, but through the pandemic, I ended up corralling a lot of the pastors of the island. And there's an organization here called the Guam Ministerial Association. And that is a collection of denominations. There's Presbyterian, there's Lutheran, there's a Baptist, but there's like a statement of faith that's very conservative. And that was also kind of dying out, the interest in that. And so through the pandemic, I was collecting all these pastors, which were actually part of this, and helping encourage pastors through it and sort things out. And then they came and said, would you lead this? We need someone who, you've started like some energy here. We want to build on that. And so, to make a long story short, the last few years I've been serving as the president of the Guam Ministerial Association, and I've been speaking to Scott some about that, about partnering with Cornerstone to help us, because the reality is what I've come to believe is like God needs all of the conservative churches here to reach the island. It's not going to be just our church, and some of that came from reading. Tim Keller has this thing he calls the gospel ecosystem, and it's like these multiple churches and faith movements that combine in a local area to have the gospel grow to its maximum potential. And what's important in that is if you understood the island and the denominations and churches here, they were very, very tribalistic, competing with each other. And oftentimes what they were competing for was the same people moving around from one church to the other. And I've tried to really deconstruct that and put an emphasis on reaching new people. We need to reach, there's plenty of unharvested grain. You're all focused on the already harvested grain, moving from one silo to another silo. How can we reach the people that aren't reached? And so Scott knows a little more in detail. I've shared with him some of the vision for how to do that. And so our church still needs to grow and overcome its challenges independently, but I want us to be an example and a model to the other churches, because a lot of the churches are in decline. So the idea is how can we lift pastors up to lead better in their churches, and then how can we bring churches together to do ministry that is easier when we are a community of churches, like reaching the foster kid need. First year I was here, there was like 100 foster kids. 10 years later, there's 600 something foster kids. And so we try to bring churches together, and we foster Parent Sunday. And so I challenge every pastor to stand up and preach a sermon on this. And every time we do, at least one new family, per church comes forward to take foster kids. So that's like a joint effort. So there's a lot of needs on the island that are like compassion type ministry that we just do better together as a bunch of churches. And instead of being tribalistic, and the hope is that the gospel footprint becomes larger, and it points to Christ instead of just the identity of one church, who's growing because they want to be a big church. And so that is in a nutshell what's going on since I've left. Is we're in our second decade, and we're excited about what the Lord's doing. So
that's so exciting, so encouraging. Yeah, it's been so cool to see over the years the Lord just again build and grow the church through his own unique ways, and sometimes in some surprising ways, and through surprising means, and then even just come to season by season demonstrate some of the reasons he has you there, what the calling for this, that again, in the moment, right? Sometimes in the moment, it was like, wait, this wasn't a part of the plan, right?
Yeah, that's right.
How's this going to work?
Hey, where are you going?
But he just has this plan he's unveiling that we get to discover in so many.
Well, I hope to have some of you Cornerstone guys come out here, over the next years and minister to the pastors by sharing Jim, you could do a session on how to survive a church fight, and
Thanks, Kevin.
church politics 101.
That's right. While we've got you and everybody's listening, how's your family doing?
Family is great. If you've seen any pictures, it's like I gave birth to giants. My sons are ginormous guys. My 9th grader, I think, is going to be the largest, and he's already like inches taller than me. We're all going to be over 6 feet tall. My oldest son, and Josiah and Ethan, the church probably that remembers the most, but Josiah graduated from UOG, works at Ducitani, which is the nicest hotel here, and has a nice job there. And he's my first kid out of the house, living on his own. Woohoo! And because grocery bill is high. I just want to say that. But then Ethan is the fitness guy. He is finishing his degree, works at a gym, and is training with the Guam Olympic team to represent them in Olympic weightlifting. So
wow.
And Caleb is graduating from high school. He'll be going to UOG as well next year. Mike is still
keeping
in high
them
school.
all on island, man.
I know. I think they're going to stay. They like it here, and they've started dating local girls. So I think that will keep them here. If they marry local, they're gonna stay, which pleases my wife a lot. So, and then my daughter is 12, and she's growing up to be a young lady. So,
and she was.
One.
She was just
not even one.
Born. Yeah, I was gonna say she wasn't even one when you guys left.
Yes.
Here. Yeah. So, wow. Well, man, this has been so fun. I mean, I always enjoy getting to talk. I'm so thankful for your friendship, man. But even more so just to get to share a little bit of this, the work that the Lord did in that season, and how He used you as such a key part of the story that He's still telling here.
Well, I had one last thing I wanted to say. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
So the whole experience in LA, the thing that I learned, that I take away with the most, was number one, the indispensable quality of an elder that's qualified to take a church through that. And the deacons of First Baptist, such a lot of great men. I don't know if he's dropped any of those names, but Mike Sylvester, Shepherd, those guys did a great job. Nestor. Support for Jim and I. And I remember we began to have these meetings where they would meet together, and seeing them was just a great learning moment, to be sitting there and watching them interact with the trustees. And I can remember this scene where the trustees were asking to have elder-like authority. And we often referred to the deacons as quasi-elders because we just technically didn't have elders in the Constitution. And they kept holding up this paper, which was this Constitution, and they kept setting it down. And they'd pick it up and they would talk about it and they would set it down. And finally, Mike Sylvester says, you should give more attention to the document underneath that piece of paper, which was the Bible that they kept covering up with, and what it has to say about church leadership. And I just... really thankful for godly leaders that God has in the church. And from that, just the sovereignty of God in everything, able to work all things together for good, weaving together so many different little decisions into one thing. John Spiegel, you could go back and say, what role did he play in it? His role in helping me come to there, and then partnering with Jim in all of that. And it was this zany, kind of nerdy Google guy, who invited me to be a youth pastor. This is sovereignty of God, how He weaves together so many of those things, right? And but in the end, I just think the church belongs to the Lord; it's not ours, and He's sovereign in that. He's the owner, and He moves people out and brings in who He wants, and I think those are the biggest takeaways that I always think about in my whole experiences there.
I think it's such a great note to end on, and I think it's the takeaways that we leave with too, Jim, actually, as
Yes.
we reflect back, right?
Yes.
The church is the Lord's.
Yes.
It's not ours.
No. The stunning thing is that you're in a situation where you think there's nothing I can do at this point, and then God's hand moves and things suddenly change, and it's powerful. Well said, Kevin.
Well, and I love you, Jim, and I'm sorry if I made you
Same.
mad when I left. So
If I ever get my hands on your neck,
I always wondered if your wife was mad at me too, so because we went through so much strain.
oh, great. Well, we loved coming to visit. That was after you moved there. That was wonderful. And I think our friendship stretches over the miles, and I so am honored to have gone through that with you. I just thought your integrity was huge, and your courage was great. So thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks for your faithfulness for the sake of the local church here and to God's glory. So, and thanks so much for the time, man. This is we really appreciate it. This was fun.
That's great. This is just great.
We'll have to do it again, in 12 years.
After the next crisis.
Well, thanks again, man. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. Know that we love you and are praising God for the story that he's writing through you, even now, in this current chapter of the history of Cornerstone. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of that. We love you, and we'll see you on Sunday.